Hey, welcome to Stack Records, episode number 2, with your hosts, Kenny and Barry. I just want to start off by saying a little bit about who we are and why we do this, why we fell in love with music. For me, it was growing up with an older brother and sister who loved music. And so my sister introduced me to Neil Young and Simon and Garfunkel, Linda Ronstadt, Carla Bonoff, all that sort of stuff. My brother, the Doors, the Dead, the Stones, the Velvets. And so I got a lot of music growing up, musical influences. And my father was a big classical music fan, so there's often a lot of opera or Mozart playing. I actually named my first dog Amadeus. It was an effort to convince my dad to let me have a dog. And then another influence was the radio. We had two particularly great radio stations, WBCN, which is a well-known radio station, and then even better was the radio station at MIT, which is WMBR. And they had all sorts of cool shows they do, like the Late Risers Club, and they do jazz, they do punk, they do like 60s stuff. They were doing like Little Steven's Underground Garage way before Little Steven was a blip. And so I'd listen to all that sort of stuff, and they talk about songs, or they play songs, or bands or artists, and I loved a lot of it. And so I'd rush out, jump on the subway, go down to Cambridge, go to the basement, Cheapo Records, and buy the 45s because they had the most amazing 45 collection ever. And so I could listen to all this stuff. And in those pre-dark internet days, listening to the radio was the only way you could get music. And then my friends and I would just spend all of our weekend days canvassing the old cool used record stores in Boston, of which there are several. Don't go looking for those now because they're all gone. But those were the glory days of record hunting in Boston, and that's really what got me into music. How about you, Barry?
So, question.
Yes.
Those radio stations, let me guess, they both are either gone or they both suck shit these days.
WBCN is gone. WBCN at one point started carrying the Patriots games of all things. They switched. They've tried different formats throughout the years, but they were a groundbreaking station. As a matter of fact, Peter Wolf was one of the original DJs on the Woofa Goofa on BCN. And so they're really a relic of the past. And there's a documentary actually you can get, which is interesting to see, on WBCN. It was that noteworthy. MIT still does, since the college still exists, there still is radio play. And as a matter of fact, a good friend of mine, Joan Hathaway, was a longtime DJ there. She's actually pretty well known in Boston because she was such a good DJ at MIT. She's not there anymore. And since I've moved out of Boston, I don't listen to the station anymore, but it does still exist, and I'm sure it's still pretty good. Emerson is the one other one that also has good music because it's a communication school.
Okay. So I'm Barry, and like Ken, I'm just a big music fan and somewhat of an authority on music. At least I like to think so. I've been really into music and collecting records, buying records, playing in bands, et cetera, since I was about 9. So that plays into why we want to do this silly podcast. We're both huge music fans, and we like to shoot the shit about music. It's as simple as that.
How many bands have you been in?
Let's see. So I started at 18 and was in bands until I was about 40. During that period, let's see, probably about about 5 bands.
Yeah.
All relatively serious in the sense that we recorded records with some of them, did a fair amount of touring, millions of shows in the San Francisco and Seattle area. So I think it was 5 or 6 if I was to include all of them.
Yeah, no, that's very cool.
And I was a drummer, just for the record. So some would say I was the person who hung out with the musicians.
Yeah. And you and I, from when we first met years ago, we instantly bonded over our love of all different types of music. So
that's right.
And that's why
in San Francisco, CA.
Yes, and that's why we're hoping to turn you, our listeners, on to bands, artists we've loved, or turn you off of bands and artists we've hated, or even good albums by bad artists, bad albums by good artists, and so forth. And so we're going to pick up where we left off last week. We're talking about Mark Lanegan, and in particular, Mark Lanegan and the albums he did with Isabel Campbell from Belle and Sebastian. So, Barry?
The larger topic was recent deaths that were music related that basically were people who meant something to us or to the wider world, and died within the last year or two. That's how we got on the Mark Lanegan topic. He died, actually, it was about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago. But then we started talking about him, Ken not being super familiar with him, and me being very familiar with him and everything he's done, and just being a super fan, essentially. Um, so I wanted to go into a bit of a deeper dive with what he did. I really think he's one of those artists who doesn't get the admiration that he deserves. I think he's still somewhat of a cult artist, believe it or not, even though he's been in huge bands like the Screaming Trees and put out many, many records and made a living as a musician for decades. I think there's a lot of people who've heard the name, but don't really know his music. He's just such an incredible rock singer in general, no matter what he's doing and who he's doing it with. He's got this voice that just resonates with me. And I think I'd mentioned to you before, Ken, that I think he's probably the best rock singer ever, certainly my favorite.
And can you explain what in particular about it is, about his voice?
There's just a depth to his singing. There's an authenticity to it that some singers sound a little forced at times, or a little too stylized, or the stylized bit of it is a little too forced.
Yep.
I don't ever get that with anything Lanegan has done. It seems like it's coming from his soul, and that's what you're looking for from any singer. Any good singer, you could say, has soul, whether they're singing soul music, rock music, whatever kind of music it is. I think that the soul of the voice comes through for the best singers, and I think he has that, or had that, in spades. And since we just touched on him a little bit during the last podcast, I wanted to go through his catalog a little more thoroughly, just for people who aren't super familiar with him, because he did do so much stuff. So he started out with this band called the Screaming Trees, which was part of the grunge movement in the late 80s, early 90s in Seattle. If anybody's going to be familiar with Mark Lanegan from the 20,000 foot view, it's probably because of the Screaming Trees. Then after that band broke up, and actually even while they're still together, he started putting out solo records. He was part of this collective called Mad Season, which was a tribute to Andrew Wood, who was the original singer of Mother Love Bone, which turned into Pearl Jam. It was a tribute to him via a record and some shows around Seattle. So there was guys from Pearl Jam and other local bands, including Lanegan. So that was another project he worked on. He was the singer on about 3 or 4 Queens of the Stone Age records. That was probably him flirting with his biggest flirt with commercial success, because those records were quite popular, and that band is probably more popular than anything he's ever been in.
Yeah, the most known, I would think.
Yeah, they're hard rock records, and they're good. I like them a lot anyway, especially the songs that Lanegan sings with them. He did a few things with the singer of Afghan Wigs, Greg Dooley. One of the projects was called Twilight Singers. They did about 1 or 2 records. Lanegan sings on some of those. They also paired up as the Gutter Twins, and they had 1 record under the Gutter Twins, which again doesn't stray far from the Afghan Wigs or the Lanegan sound. Pretty straightforward, darkish rock. And then you'd mentioned the records with Isabel Campbell, which are somewhat of a tribute, at least I see them as a tribute to Lee Hazelwood and Nancy Sinatra and those records they did.
And I listened to the first one, I listened to Ballad of the Broken Seas, and I definitely get that, and I see that. The difference just being that the Lee and Nancy record is much more accessible, in terms of much more pop. But I definitely love bands that have 2 singers. I love the interplay between 2 different singers, especially when they're very So it's that's the way they play off each other.
Yeah, agreed. He also did a couple records with a guy named Duke Garwood, who I guess is a friend, was a friend of his, and I had never heard of him until he started working with Lanegan. And they did two records. One's called Black Pudding, and one is called With Animals. And those came out, I think, around 2012 and then 2017 or 18. Anyway, the With Animals record is the one to get.
Okay.
It's largely electronic, sparse, but just incredible performance by Lanegan, and really great songs. That would be one of the ones I would point to if somebody said, "Oh, I want to check out Mark Lanegan." A couple others that I would recommend. There's an English band called Soul Savers, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, Ken, but Lanegan was the singer on their first two full length, or it was their second and third record, but one's called It's Not How Far You Fall, It's How You Land, and the second one is called Broken. And Lanegan is a singer on both of them. Highly recommend those. Again, not too far from what Lanegan normally does. Somewhat dark sounding, but really, really good stuff. And if you haven't listened to those, I suggest checking them out.
I definitely will. I'm not familiar with them, and I will definitely check them out. Now, so he's recorded with a whole bunch of different people and all. Is that his just sort of search for like always trying to find something new or trying to find something interesting, or does he wear it as welcome with other artists?
I would say it's a tribute to how highly regarded he was by other musicians. I think more often than not, and I don't really know for sure, but I have a feeling people sought him out. These people like Soul Savers or Greg Dooley or Duke Garwood. Another guy he did a record with, his final record, Joe Cardamone is his name, and he was in a band called Icarus Line. So I don't think it was a matter of him wearing out his welcome. I do know by reading his book, Sing Backwards and Weep, that came out in 2020. I do know that he was constantly searching and trying and moving. He would get dissatisfied with doing the same thing over and over and over again. I think that was part of what led to him leaving the Screaming Trees. So yeah, I think it was just, he was such a good singer that people wanted to work with him. And if he appreciated the people like they appreciated him, he was more than happy to work with them. That's my guess anyway. I don't know. I've never talked to him about it. And yeah, and finally, okay, so in 2020, his last solo record proper came out. It's called Straight Songs of Sorrow. Very sparse. That was such a great finishing record for him. I think it might be his strongest record, actually. And I think I'd mentioned it before, but it's a companion piece to the book he wrote, where a lot of the songs deal with a lot of the stuff he wrote about in his autobiography. And it's pretty harsh stuff. The subject matter is pretty dark and pretty harsh, but really moving and poignant. Really great record.
And so, unlike the other artists that were on the list, the rock deaths that we talked about, you would say he would have still, if he was still alive, would still be recording music you would find interesting.
Yes, for sure. I think over the last 15 years or so, he's put out his best material by far, and didn't seem like he was going away anytime soon. He apparently he had quite a drug and alcohol problem up until I think the mid 2000s. And it was after he supposedly kicked those problems when he started really becoming way more prolific, putting out a record or two a year on his own or with some of these teamings that I had mentioned. So I fully expected him to go for another 10 to 20 years putting out stuff that I thought was really valid and really good. So it was a huge loss when he died.
Yeah, because as opposed to some of the other people on that list, like David Crosby, Astrid Gilberto, they were not about to release more music. So,
well, I don't know. I was looking forward to the next Herb Alpert record myself. Sorry, not to make not.
When did that Tony Bennett Lady Gaga album come out?
That was what, maybe within the last 4 or 5 years.
And the guy he just died at 98. So you never know, I guess.
Yeah, when those records that come out when it's some young artist with an old fart like Tony Bennett, I usually think they're very gimmicky and usually don't.
There's no question. It's just I'm surprised he was recording anything. So
yeah. I'm sure it felt good to him to be recognized by somebody contemporary like Lady Gaga.
Yeah. But again, going back to that list, like I said, I don't think anyone on that list was like, oh my God, what a tragic loss. And then you point out that in Mark Lanegan's case, it was, and you convinced me. So.
The only other one who I think still would have put out good music, I can't remember if I mentioned him during the last call, Angelobadalamenti, who did soundtrack work mainly with David Lynch.
Soundtrack work, yeah, you can definitely be doing that for forever. So.
Yeah, just ask Ennio Morricone.
He's not going to be handicapped, so.
Yeah, so that's really all I wanted to talk about as far as Lanegan goes. I just think anybody who is not familiar with him could do themselves a favor by checking out some of the stuff we've talked about. They're just, almost all of them have something really, even his lesser records have something very, very good on them.
And are they reasonably easy to locate still? One of the smaller labels.
Yeah, with the resurgence of vinyl, most of this stuff is back in print. So if you're to try and find original copies of a lot of this stuff, it would cost you an arm and a leg. But you could get reissues of almost everything on this list for regular record prices, and $20, $25.
CD as well, or just vinyl?
Well, CD for sure on everything. And actually, that's a good point, because the ones with Isabel Campbell, those haven't been re-released on vinyl. So you'd have to get the CDs, and you could get those for probably $10 a piece. But I can only imagine coming around the corner is reissues on vinyl for those. Everything is getting reissued these days on vinyl, and I can only imagine that'll be the case for those 3 records eventually.
All right, and then you'd said you wanted to move on to someone else on that list, and for anyone who's interested, you can go back to episode 1 to hear the list in full. We're not going to go over the whole list now, but who is someone else you'd want to go talk about?
Well, shanemcgowan, actually. I'm curious to get your take on him, because I've always he's held up with such high regard by a lot of celebrities as well as regular folks like us. But I think he is, and people regard him as like the most amazing poet ever, and I just think he's really overrated. I like the Pogues, I like a few of their records a lot, but I think he was grossly overrated and just sort of a buffoon.
It's interesting. It seems like there are some artists you're supposed to like and respect and admire, and he's one of them. And I think that sometimes it's right, and oftentimes, like, I agree with you in this case. I don't know how right that really is. That said, and I really do like the Pogues, in particular. Rum Sodomy and the Lash is one of my favorite albums. I love that album, but I didn't have all of their albums by any means. Unlike you, I didn't ever see them in concert. And so while I was certainly a Pogues fan, they were not like he was not Bob Dylan to me. Like he didn't occupy that upper echelon. And I
Not even close.
yeah no and but I think you're right. I think for a lot of people he did, and it's surprising, but it's just like I mentioned on our last podcast about Eddie Vedder. I think a lot of people would put Eddie Vedder up there in Pearl Jam, and I just don't get it. Just if you can tell me what you would love so much about Eddie Vedder's voice, I'd be curious. Because again, I don't, whereas again with the Pogues, I really do like them. It's just like you, I don't think he should be so highly venerated.
Yeah, it's almost like he's been elevated to sainthood.
Yeah.
And if you've watched that movie, the documentary about him that came out 5-6 years ago, he comes across as just a drugged out, drunken boob, in my opinion.
I think another, an artist who I also liked quite a bit, but I think also was put in more of a, on a pedestal than he should, was Graham Parsons. And again, and I'm a Graham Parsons fan. I really do like Graham Parsons, but some people were like, "Oh my God, like he invented country rock and he did this and he did that and all," and it's like, okay, pump the brakes a bit.
It's weird how certain people do get anointed, and it's somewhat hard to figure out why it happens to some and why it doesn't to others who are maybe more deserving. I wonder if do you think it's because a lot of these people are the ones who lived somewhat tragic lives or had tragic demises? They're messed up and with drugs or alcohol or whatever the case may be. Graham Parsons being another one. He was total junkie and
And I think also people, I think once again, I like her music, but amywinehouse was another one where I think, elevated to a higher, platform than I would have, put her on.
I've speaking of her, I have that Back to Black record.
Yeah.
And I listened to it recently after the song Rehab, which I think is undoubtedly a great pop tune. That record sucks.
And
after that song,
and I've listened to it, and I don't think I'd say it sucks, but it's certainly that song stands out as way better than anything else in the record.
No, Ken, it sucks.
Okay. And I have not heard it in quite a while, so but she too, and not to the extent of Graham Parsons or shanemcgowan by any way, but again, she too was sort of like, oh, Amy Winehouse, and it's weird. Just again, that some artists like that, and then other ones you're like, wait, why'd that record label drop that guy? Like he was amazing, and I don't know. I do think there's part of it that people like the people who are drunks or drug addicts or whatever, for whatever reason that carries, like, people find them more exciting and more interesting, and I think that was
extra gravitas.
Yeah, and I think that was certainly partly the case with Morrison,
Sure. Jimmy.
Yeah.
And I got to admit, I'm drawn to those sorts of stories. I like the stories where the people are just out of control and they do lots of horrible things to themselves and to others, but they're these creative geniuses, like a Jimmy. I don't think Jimmy has a reputation for being horrible to other people, but he certainly got pretty messed up. But with drugs.
But more like Jim Morrison, even like, more the case of like, where he was a guy you were just waiting for the announcement he had died, so.
Well, I would have been quite young when that happened, so I wasn't waiting for it, but I imagine you were.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, I think people like someone who lives on the edge. And then it's surprising, then when you see someone like, I don't know, like Paul McCartney, where it's like the complete opposite, and yet, he also is, of course, highly popular.
His life and lifestyle doesn't have a single iota of that edge we're talking about.
It's really interesting that, and yet, when you talk about, not the greatest artist of all time necessarily, but certainly the most well-known, the most popular and all, top 10, top 20. So there's one way to skin a cat.
You would know.
Yeah.
I know you don't like cats.
Yeah.
So another name I wanted to bring up, just because there's kind of an interesting anecdote. Wayneshorter. So it's obviously a different genre of music. Him being a
Jazz.
jazz guy. I love a lot of his records that I have, and he was considered one of the greatest living from that whole era of 60s jazz icons. But what's kind of a weird coincidence, let me think, if I want to remember the connection here. So remember in the late 90s, there was a plane that went down off of the coast of New York. I think it was like TWA flight, whatever, and like all 400 people died or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Sounds vaguely familiar, but
okay. So, it was one of those big plane crashes that we seem to have every 5 to 10 years. Anyway, his wife was on that. She died. And recently I watched this Artpepper documentary. Artpepper, another jazz guy, one of my favorites, notorious junkie from the 50s up until he got clean finally in the 80s. And anyway, the reason I even bring this up, and might just be a useless point to bring up, but his wife was largely responsible for getting Artpepper clean. His wife was good friends with Artpepper's like third or fourth wife, and they all lived in the LA area at the time. And his Wayneshorter's wife, I think, was some sort of counselor, drug counselor or something. And anyway, really was largely responsible for finally getting Artpepper clean for the final time. And then he died a few years later after he had this great resurgence in his career and everything.
how many of those great jazz artists from the 50s and 60s weren't junkies?
1%. I added them up.
It's just crazy. And unfortunately, as bad as other drugs are, heroin is really a killer. So it's amazing Miles lived as long as he did. So
yeah, for sure. They literally, you could go down the line and it probably is close to 90% of the greats went through it.
We've John Coltrane. I mean, it's just amazing. So.
And a lot of them, of course, made it through the other side, but a lot of them didn't. I was just listening to a record by Grantgreen, who was a great jazz guitarist, and he was another one who put out 1 million records on Blue Note, was the de facto Blue Note guitarist during that creative spell from like the mid 50s to the early 70s. He was the go-to guitarist. He didn't make it out. He died at 42 or something.
And Coltrane was in his 20s.
Well, Coltrane, though, he did get clean. He didn't die. It may have been related to his heart problems, but he much like some of the others, he didn't go years and years as a junkie. I think he had a period in the late 50s for a year or two, but he was largely clean. And I think once he came out of it, that whole spiritual thing with him is where that came into being, with A Love Supreme and all that stuff that he did thereafter.
Which is great stuff. Interesting thing, touching on the jazz label. I can't think of any other musical genre where one label so dominated the genre. I mean, Blue Note, like the Blue Note, or like you could just point to any, of their records. Like most of them are just fantastic records. And I can't think of the other labels that were,
There's a couple. Okay. Prestige was up there.
Yep. That wasn't a good label. Yep.
Riverside was another one.
Okay, don't know that one as well. Okay.
Verve, which oddly enough, the Velvet Underground were on, but they were predominantly a jazz label when they signed the Velvet Underground, which is weird.
Yes.
Can you think of anything more the polar opposite of jazz than the Velvet Underground?
No. And it's interesting when labels do that and all. But one of the reasons I like the Grateful Dead so much is because they do a lot of like country and western, and they do a lot of jazz. And so two of my favorite genres, and they're genres you wouldn't think you would mix in music.
What jazz do the Grateful Dead do?
Listen to stuff like Dark Star, and it really it's very, some of the early stuff in particular is very jazz.
Really?
Yeah.
Like, are you talking about these 40-minute extended versions when they're playing live, or stuff on records?
Yeah, more stuff live, but even on record. And that's the thing, is they would go into concerts and they wouldn't have a set list. They go up there and they're just like, okay, whatever, and they start playing, and they're playing, and while they're playing, they sort of then communally go into a song, and then they're playing that, and they go into another song, and so forth. And that's definitely sort of jazz-like approach to music, of just letting the music take you where you want to go, as opposed to like the Rolling Stones, where here's our set list, and it's the same set list every night for the next 50 nights in a row.
And I'm well aware of all that, but I would never call and I would call it more jamming than jazz. I mean, there's obviously jazz, free
Right.
form jazz is mainly jamming, but there's also different types of drum grooves and chording and that sort of thing that makes it jazz. I've never heard any of that in any of the Dead music that I've heard.
Again, listen to Dark Star, listen to Space and Drums, which is always part of their live concerts.
Yeah.
And it definitely has a jazz feel to me when they go and start doing that sort of stuff. So, have you ever seen them?
No, I haven't seen the Dead, but I did see the Jerry Garcia band with David Grisman at Squaw Valley in the Tahoe area in Northern California. It was one of the I think it was the second week Michelle and I were together, and it was a big outdoor music festival at Squaw Valley. You know what Squaw Valley is, right? It's where they had the the 80 Winter Olympics, or no, that was Lake Placid. Oh no, it was like the 62 Winter Olympics were at Squaw Valley, early 60s or something like that. Anyway, you're familiar with the Lake Tahoe area, right?
Yeah, no, I used to go up there with Bill. Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, it was during the summer, obviously, and it's a big outdoor festival. And the thing I remember most about that is I fell asleep.
Okay, I love that stuff he did with David Grisman. And that's not jazzy. That's definitely more, country, folk type of stuff.
Bluegrassy.
Bluegrass, definitely. Jerry loved bluegrass. That's where he started as a bluegrass guitarist. And he used to actually teach bluegrass guitar as well. And as a matter of fact, Bob Weir was one of his first students, and that's how they met. But yeah, I love those albums. Yeah, the Old and in the Way. That's the name.
I have that one.
Yeah.
So did you see the Dead when they were still the Dead?
Many times. Yeah.
Yeah. What years?
Yeah, the 80s to the early 80s to like early 90s, mid 90s. Once Jerry died.